Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashai, Swami Sri Yukteswar Ji, beloved Guru, Paramahansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, we bow to all of you. We offer you our lives, our love, and our devoted service. May we be able to share thy love with all souls. Om. Peace. Amen. Please sit down. And let's sit up and meditate for a few moments. Shanti, Shanti. I have to confess to a serious difficulty. I am feeling so much bliss, it's hard to control myself. And I may find it difficult to speak, so please forgive me. But I want to talk a little bit about these vows. First of all, I want you to understand that they are not grim vows. They're very serious vows. But they must be taken and understood in a spirit of bliss. The time of when Swami Shankaracharya founded the Swami order, he couldn't say the things that he certainly knew, but they couldn't be explained to people because that was Kali Yuga, and people did not know that everything is just consciousness. You couldn't explain such a thing to them. You had to say, you had to address their awareness that everybody was different from everybody else, that everybody had egos, that Shankar himself said that everything is a dream, but he couldn't go further than that. And so people, when he made his Swami vows, he had to talk only in terms of what people would not do. Now, this is fine. We should still not do certain things. We all know what those things are, and we don't need to go into them in detail, because obviously we should be self-controlled. Obviously we should not desire things. Obviously we should give up our attachments. In fact, one of the things that I have always recommended, or I should say recommended for many, many years, is that every night you build a fire in your mind, just as the fire of sannyas was recommended, and that you cast into that fire mentally every seed of desire, every attachment, every thing that keeps you bound to your body. This is very important to do, but it's not enough. Once you've gotten rid of that, what have you got? You know, I was in Thailand many years ago in 1958, and I read an interesting official pronouncement by the Buddhists in Thailand comparing nirvana with Satchidananda. And of course they had to favor their own method. And so what they were saying is that, well, it's true that you do feel a certain amount of bliss for a moment, but then you have nothingness. Well, can you imagine anybody working sincerely to become nothing? It sounds too ridiculous even to think about. Of course, and where did Buddha's compassion come from? Could that have come from nothing? Obviously he had great love. Obviously he felt great bliss. What my Guru did, and one of the wonderful things, what our Guru did, and one of the wonderful things that he accomplished in his mission was to show how each of these stages of history, where the different teachings have been given regarding God and the Absolute and man's role in the universe, was that he showed how all of them are one. He showed that Buddha came, for example, to get rid of dependence on karmakand. Karmakand is ceremonies that people practice, but to achieve certain powers, to achieve victory in war, or a good wife, or a good success, or whatever it might be, or even victory over one's enemies, whatever it was. But he said that karma kand is all right, and it may help you to go to heaven for a while, but it will not give you the goal of all life, which is to find salvation in God. And so he said, don't think about what God will do for you. Think what you can do to change yourself. So he didn't mention the word God, because too many people, I noticed there was a story that I remember from when I was with my guru and Devi Mukherjee from Calcutta. Let's see, how did that go? I'm sorry, I've got to rethink this a little bit. That's the trouble with eating bliss. Everything else goes out of your mind.
How can there be ego when there is no consciousness of self?
No. My guru scolded Debbie because he was very light-minded, and he used to joke a lot of the time. And so Master said to him, why do you keep joking and keeping everybody light? You should be more serious. And Debbie said, well, I'd like to change, Master, but how can I do so without your blessings? And everybody, when I've told that story in India, they said, oh, what a beautiful answer. And then when Master gave his answer, everybody, oh. Because what Master said was, my blessings are there already. God's blessings are there. It's your blessings that are lacking. And what Buddha was saying was that he wanted people not to depend on God's and Guru's blessings. He wanted them to do something. He wanted them to add their blessings to the mix. And so also Buddha didn't talk about God for that reason, but because he didn't talk about God. And what you always find every time one of these avatars is born into this world, he says something and people take it and go to the horizon with it. Well, you know, if the goal of your seeking is the equator, people coming from the north should stop at the equator. People coming from the south should stop at the equator. But what happens is, human nature being what it is, it keeps going. And so people coming south of the equator say, when they see people coming north, no, you're supposed to go south. And the people in the south say, no, you're supposed to be north, go north. And so they fight. And there you have all the battle between religions. But in fact, what we need to do is come to that midpoint. And always these great masters come to help correct mistakes. But people have to understand when to stop that correction. And what Buddhists did, not Buddha, but Buddhists, they decided that therefore, because Buddha had not talked about God, therefore there was no God. And so, several centuries later, Shankaracharya had to come in and explain that, yes, God does exist, but he doesn't have a trunk, he doesn't have 4 arms, and he doesn't have a veena or something, and he is consciousness, and he is Satchidananda. Well, when his followers came onto the scene, they began to think that all these gods are nothing, it's all just a mental abstraction, and so they became absolutely without devotion. Well, without devotion, as Swami Sri Yukteswar, the Jnanavatar of our age, said, you cannot advance a single step toward God without devotion. But they didn't have devotion. So Ramanuja had to come in and explain that, in fact, there is a soul. It isn't just an abstraction. The soul does exist, but it's a part of that consciousness. And so then Chaitanya came and re-emphasized that point and spoke about the importance of chanting, and he spoke about Maha Mantra. And he said that the saying he had in Bengali was, Harer Nam, Harer Nam, Harer Nam Kevalam. Only through God's name can God be found. Well, unfortunately, people were not ready for the true teaching. And so he had to dilute it, and this happens because people are people. And so what he meant was Om. Om is the name of God. Krishna is not the name of God. Krishna is something you speak with your mouth. Om is the sound you can't speak with your mouth, you become merged in it. So it's really only through Om that you can attain that, by meditating on Om and merging in it. But people began to think only by chanting Maha Mantra will you find God. Well, from the life of Ramakrishna, they went to a Vaishnava gathering where everybody was chanting Maha Mantra. And I think it was Sardananda who was writing this. He said that it was a very drab occasion. Maha Mantra was not doing it for them because they didn't have heart. And I remember in America when Swami Bhaktivedanta Prabhupada, he came to San Francisco while I was living there. And because I speak Bengali, or some Bengali, he used to like to talk to me. And we would chat sometimes, but then what happened was he had this Maha Mantra, then everybody started talking. No meditation, nothing. And I remember him talking strongly against these Advaitins. Well, okay. I remember, however, one time he said, Ramakrishna was a fool. I said, what are you saying, Swamiji? He used to worship the Divine Mother. Well, to Bhaktivedanta, God was blue and he played a flute. And so I said, but he also worshipped Krishna. Oh, I didn't know that. All right. Nanda Mohima was a fool. I said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, she worshipped the Divine Mother. I said, I was also present when she was worshipping Krishna. Oh. I think what he was really working up to, and didn't dare say it, was to call my guru a fool. And I just left him. I don't like to argue, especially with old men. And so anyway, a friend of mine, Allen Ginsberg, told me toward the end of Bhaktivedanta's life that Bhaktivedanta said to him, where have I gone wrong? He used to take anybody because he had the idea that all they need to do is chant Maha Mantra, they'll be saved. So he accepted criminals, he accepted all sorts of people who were totally unworthy, and they were not saved. They just, there was one time when 3 Swamis went out onto a lake, 2 came back. This kind of thing went on. And Maha Mantra alone won't do it for you. You've got to understand. But because of this, gradually other people had to come in. Ramakrishna came in, Master came in, he explained all these things, showed the importance of devotion. He said that God has no form. And Advaita is an absolutely true teaching, but it has to have this devotion of the heart. Otherwise, I can know that there's a good restaurant next door, but if I'm not hungry, I'll never go there. I have to have that hunger. And so, in the Swami order, there is this rejection, but we need to understand the further truth, that infinite one, how did he create matter? He dreamed it out of his own consciousness. Matter is not a reality. In Kali Yuga, it is considered a reality because the only reality they know. In our age, science has proved to us that matter is energy. Nothing else is real except energy. And scientists are saying further that energy looks like a condensation of thoughts. And those thoughts look like condensations of consciousness. And so now, at last, we are at that moment in ascending Dwapara Yuga, in the ascending yugas, where people can begin to understand that this body is not a reality, and that this ego also looks suspiciously unreal. And it is possible now for people, at least theoretically, to understand that your body and my body are manifestations of the same truth. that your ego and my ego are really only waves on the great ocean of spirit. And this was the teaching that Master brought to our times in such a clear clarity of explanation that it's actually thrilling to contemplate. That although we look separate from one another, and this is what we need to do, and the reason for this Nayaswami ceremony is that we want to dedicate ourselves to seeking that reality within, which will help us to understand that this ego itself is a delusion, that we are waves on the infinite ocean. I remember one time I was sitting with Master, and I was sitting before him, and he was editing his Gita, and I was helping him that way, but he was doing the work then, and I was just sitting and thinking what a blessing it was to be his disciple, and feeling great love for him. And when he finished, then he asked me to help him to his feet, and he just held my hands like this and looked with great bliss into my eyes, and he said, just a bulge of the ocean. He said he never wanted to accept that people were his disciples. They were God's disciples. Everything is God. This is the supreme teaching. Everything is God, and you can't say you are God as long as you think you're an ego. But you have to say you're not anything else. God is you. What else is there to be? There's no other reality in existence. And your goal in life has to be to understand, to reach that point of realization where you know that you have no separate reality. In fact, what happens is this, that as you go deeper and you go into the ego, go more and more deeply into the ego, gradually it disappears. And then when you understand, there are two stages of samadhi. In the first stage, you leave your ego, but it still lingers as a memory in your consciousness. So when you come out of your meditation, you can still go back to ego, and you can actually fall from that state. So the first stage of samadhi is sabhikalpa samadhi. And my guru told me several cases of people he knew who had had sabhikalpa samadhi at one time and had lost it. Paul Brunton was one example. My guru said he couldn't forget that he was an Englishman. Paul Brunton got very offended because his guru, Ramana Maharshi, had his brother as a sort of caretaker in the ashram, and his brother was a martinet. And to Paul Brunton, this thought that an Indian could treat him like that, he couldn't overcome that thought, and he left his guru. And this does happen. It's not so often, but it does. The path to God is long and difficult. However, when you've attained nirvikalpa samadhi, there's no ego to go back to. And so Master said that when you attain nirvikalpa, then you achieve the state. They achieve the state of jivan mukta. A jivan mukta has no more karma to make. However, it just goes on and on. There's still that memory. He can't think that I'm doing anything because he doesn't think of himself. He doesn't see himself as existing. But he has that memory of having been a pirate, a businessman, a billion of other things. A woman, a man, an animal, a slug, a worm, who knows, everything. And he has to go back into all those lives. And it is possible in one meditation even to get rid of the lives of a whole incarnation. What you have to do is see God as having dreamed that life too. And then it disappears. But you have to get rid of that part of your dream which is just memory. And in that memory, you have to see it was all gone. Now when you've reached that point where all those memories are completely dissolved, then you become a siddha, a paramukta. My guru said that of the saints in Autobiography of a Yogi, very few were completely liberated. I said, but sir, what about Master Mahashaya, no, he was Jivan Mukta. Anandamoyi Ma, no, she was a Jivan Mukta. Your father, oh, he had too much attachment to his sons. He thought of us as his sons. And so he went down the list. And I asked him about Ramana Maharshi, no, Jivan Mukta. He said the only saints who were completely liberated were Babaji, Lahiri Mahashai, Swamiji Yukteswar, and the two of Lahiri Mahashai's disciples, Swami Ram Gopal Mojumdar, the sleepless saint, and Pranabananda. Pranabananda, the saint with, the sleepless saint and the saint with two bodies, right? Sorry. Anyway, and then he didn't talk about himself at that time, but many times he said to us, I killed Yogananda long ago. No one lives in this body but God. And I said to him once, are you an avatar? And he said sort of obliquely, it would be necessary for an avatar to start a mission of this importance. One time I asked him, were you Jesus Christ? He said, what difference would it make? But I can't help suspecting that he was, because when I worked on his book, The Revelations of Christ, the similarity of personality was very amazingly strong. You know, one interesting thing is that when you attain liberation, you don't just become an ocean. You retain that memory of having been a particular drop in that ocean. And that memory endures to this extent that you always attain. There's that song they used to sing in America, there will never ever be another you. Well, this is what it is. There will never be another person like you. You are, because of that memory, which is a part of omniscience, you will always remain you. So that when a devotee prays to you, for example, in meditation, what comes to you is not some sort of mysterious something out of the ether labeled God. What comes to him at that time is you yourself as God. But you will be that particular aspect of God which will never die. So you don't lose anything in seeking God. People think, well, I'll lose my body, I'll lose my home, I'll lose my children, I'll lose this and this. But they don't lose even their egos, even in the end. Although our goal is to destroy this ego, that part of it cannot be destroyed. You cannot destroy that memory that you were God and then became Sushil and Satish and so on, and then that God, even as God, remembers that he was Satish. So that in that particular way, you will always remain unique. So you don't lose anything in seeking God. And people keep thinking of, well, but I'll have to give up this and give up that. The marvel is you don't have to give up anything. But at first you have to give up everything. And so the first thing on the spiritual path is to give up this thought that that I desire this, I am attached to that, I define myself in these ways. What we have to do, however, finally, is give up all our self-identifications. We have to give up the thought that I'm Indian, I'm an American, I'm a man, I'm a woman, I get angry too easily, I like food, I like to fast. All the self-definitions that we have that bind ourselves to our mental attitudes, to our anger, to our greed, to our lust, to whatever it is. And the amazing thing that you will find is that when you really have overcome any quality that you like to name, when you've really overcome it, you think, what on earth was all the difficulty about? It just seems at that point ridiculous that you felt so attached to that this particular thing was so important to you. It becomes, as it says in the Bhagavad Gita, that in the second chapter, Krishna says these warriors cannot die, the soul cannot die. What he's meaning here too is that no matter what qualities you have, they become transmuted the soul thinks, but if I lose this quality of lust or anger, I'll destroy a part of myself. And what he's saying is that you transmute that thought, and that anger becomes forgiveness, and that lust becomes self-control, and all these qualities that were so important to you, don't lose them, they just take on a new quality. The one thing that remains, interestingly, is Ashwatthama. Ashwatthama was Amar. Why? Because the other qualities become transmuted into their opposites. But Ashwatthama stands for attraction. Isn't that the word? I think attraction. Anyway, when you find God, you don't lose your attraction. I don't think that's quite the word, and I'm trying to get the exact one, but you can understand what I mean. That when you have lost that, you don't lose, you've lost all the other qualities, they become transformed, but attraction remains a reality for you. It becomes rasha, supremely relishable. And so when you find God, you find everything there, everything you become attracted to, bliss itself. And that's what makes it Amar, deathless. So then, in the Nayaswami vow and all the vows preceding that, the important thing is to understand that we must get rid of that attachment, throw into the fire every self-definition, and when we have finally done that, we will realize that we have that freedom. So the Nayaswami vow is not only rejecting, it's a positive vow. Its emphasis is on, it's samadhi-oriented. It is oriented towards finding what your reality is, not just rejecting your false reality. This, then, is the purpose of life. We have to understand that we are God in the true sense. You are not your little self. Never tell yourself, I'm a sinner. You may have sinned, but that's not you. You in yourself are ever perfect. You in yourself will always understand that my reality is part of the infinite bliss. I remember many years ago, I was 21 years old, and I decided to give up smoking. I had been smoking for 2 years. I was pretty young then, after all. But you know, smoking is not easy to give up. When I tried, it was like Mark Twain, who said that smoking is the easiest habit in the world to give up. I've done it 1,000 times. Well, I would not smoke in the morning, and at lunch I'd remember how nice a smoke was with my coffee. And so I'd go back to smoking. Now here was the interesting thing. I never told myself, I suppose it was my good karma, but I never told myself I failed. I always said I have not yet succeeded. Now that's what I want you to do with your vows. Even if you fail, don't tell yourself I have failed. Tell yourself, I have not yet succeeded. A vow is a very serious thing, but human nature has a strong grip on us. Don't ever tell yourself, I have failed. If you do, take the vow seriously. But remember, if you do fail, don't just throw in the towel and give up. Say, I have not yet succeeded. And you will find that in time, you will make this vow perfect in your life. And God does not expect perfection, but He does expect that we take our spiritual lives very seriously. So this then is what I'm asking of you. I'm not asking you to punish yourselves. I'm asking you to accept these vows with bliss and to expect the best of life, and you will achieve this in time. Remember, we don't lessen the importance of rejection of bad habits. We don't lessen the objection, the importance of realizing that we have to give up those things which bind us to the wheel of reincarnation. These things are necessary, and the vows that Shankaracharya gave are absolutely necessary. But you know, in those days, women couldn't, he had to discipline the body. And so he had to put people in this position where they weren't allowed to stay in any one place for more than 3 days. This is the literal teaching. And in 3 days, you're supposed to move on. And that way, in an outward way, you can't be attached to a place where you stay only 3 days. That was the idea. You can't, you have to walk the highways, you can't take vehicles and so on. Can you imagine doing that nowadays? Walking the highways with motor cars spewing fumes into your mouth? It just wouldn't work. And another thing, that walking the highways is not appropriate for women. And so women were somewhat excluded from taking sannyas vows, although many have done it, and quite rightly. But they can't follow that rule either, literally. It would just not be appropriate for a woman to go strolling through roaming the highways like that. And so it is that sannyasis, even today, they have houses of their own, ashrams of their own. They have money, they have bank accounts, and they do it with the quite correct thought, and I'm not objecting to it a moment. You can't live in this world nowadays that way, especially in the West. How could you imagine somebody going with a begging bowl to your house? He'd be considered a beggar. Master never liked that word beggar. He had this song, Door of My Heart, Hridaya Kutira Dwar Kola Ache Onibar Da Kore Onibar Esheki Jurabehiye. And then he went on to say, there was in this original song in Bengali, it said, Ami Bikhiri, I am a beggar. And he didn't want to translate that. He would not admit that he was a beggar. He said, I have a right to know God. I am not going to beg him. He deserves it. I deserve to know him. If I love him, he must come to me. And so he taught to speak with great vigor. I know. I lived with him. I know how he spoke. And most people, after reading his book, are quite shocked when they hear his voice, because they see his great sweetness. But my God, he could be powerful. This day marks the beginning of a new era! And he went on like that. It was just the most powerful talk I remember him giving that I've ever heard in my life. He was very powerful, but he was very sweet too. And we have to understand that to be a renunciate truly means to be very, very determined. The trouble is with that teaching that many people become egotistical. And the color orange has this disadvantage. You know the color that highway people work when they're working on the roads? They wear orange. Why? So they'll be seen, so that cars won't hit them. And orange is a color that draws energy to itself. It says, look at me. Well, this is not what we want now. And in fact, I have to say, with all humility, and not with criticism, because I know human nature is human nature, but I have to say, I have met many arrogant swamis. And they think that their purpose in life is to be served, not to serve. These are not good things. We have to realize that if we become renunciates, we must think in terms of what we can do for others, not of what they will do for us. So many attitudes need to be changed. And in this day and age, it is possible to change them. Never easy, but possible. We have to realize that our reality is God, and that we must serve God and everybody to get rid of this thought that I am separate, so that when people insult you, don't get all upset. Take all the disadvantageous things that happen to you in life and make a good thing of them. When somebody insults you, thank him. When somebody tells you you're no good, thank him. When somebody tries to hurt you, thank him. Tell him, I know that I have many faults. I'm happy if you want to point them out. And if this isn't a fault of yours, then turn it in a positive way. Many years ago, there was a member of our Ananda community. He was an artist, and because he did fairly good work, I was happy to have him there because I wanted people to be encouraged to also take up artistic things and so on. And so when he didn't pay, I said, all right, let it be. But after 12 years, we got a new general manager in the community. And he said to this man, why do you always, and it was the truth, he would, in any group gathering, he'd always try to ask me questions that would embarrass me. And he said, why do you keep criticizing? And this man said, well, I think it probably helps the community to have a fault finder. It'll keep them on their toes. And so the new general manager said, well, I can see that it may be good for us, but what's it doing for you? And he said, well, I don't know. And so the general manager said to him, I'm going to tell you this, either begin to pay your monthly fees as everybody else is doing, or leave the community. You have that choice. So the man was so arrogant, he just left the community. Then he came over to me and spent 1 good hour or more telling me all my faults as he perceived them. I didn't say anything. I just let him rave, and then afterwards, however, after he'd left, I wrote the song, which is ever since I've considered one of my best songs. Though green summer fade and winter draw near, my Lord, in your presence, I'm sorry, my voice isn't holding up too well. My Lord, in your presence, I live without fear. Through tempest, through snows, through turbulent tide, the touch of your hand is my strength and my guide. I ask for no riches that death can destroy. I crave only thee, your love and your joy. I ask for no riches that death can destroy. I crave only thee, your love and your joy. The dancers must pass, will pass, the singing must end. I welcome the darkness with you for my friend. So I turned it in a positive way, and this is what we must do. I turned it into a beautiful song. Turn it into something that will uplift you. And in these ways, get rid of this thought that you are owed anything by anybody. You are just a child of God, and if people kill you, I have often thought that my life is a public life, and I declare my certainties very strongly sometimes. It would not surprise me at all to be martyred if somebody like Gandhi, somebody treated me as they treated Gandhi and just shot me. I couldn't care less. It wouldn't matter to me. It would be rather a nice ending. So keep your guns outside. Let me at least finish this talk. But who knows, maybe some Swami, for example. Who knows? There was a Swami I knew, and he one day he went to the Jamuna and threw all his orange clothes into the river. He said, "This is humbug. This is not true renunciation." And the renunciates I have seen are not true renunciates. And he was killed by a renunciate, by another Swami. These things can happen. Who cares? But we have to understand that this ego, sooner or later you'll have to give it up anyway. What does it matter? If you can go in God, as Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, when you think of God at the moment of death, you go to Him. Don't think of the Pitris, don't think of the all the other gods and everything. Think of God, you will go to Him. And even at the last moment of life, you will go to Him. but prepare yourselves for that final exam. That is what renunciation is all about. It is not a virtue in itself, it's a preparation for a higher calling. It's a preparation for merging in God. So apart from renunciation, the emphasis must be on samadhi, on merging. And so our emphasis is in this vow ceremony entirely positive, very stern, but at the same time very blissful. And so I have created several steps to this, and they're all a part of the Nayaswami order. In the beginning is a deep dedication to this as your path. You may be married, you may not be yet ready to renounce everything, you may still want a wife or a husband or a good job or whatever it might be. But if your sincere intention is to really give yourself more and more to God, if you are convinced in your heart that this is the goal of your life and of all life, then you can take the pilgrim vow. And if you are married but want to give up the attachment to home and family, you must fulfill your duty to your children. They are your karma. You can't do like the story that a beautiful story though that my guru told once of a man who was married, but he kept saying to God that if you call me God, I will leave everything. And that was his prayer. And one day his wife just gave birth and died in giving birth. And his child was there, and he thought, just then he heard the voice of God saying, "Beloved, come to me." And he thought, I've made this vow, I will do it, but please God, help me to understand that my little baby will be taken care of. It was there in the house crying. And the man went out into the bushes, and he waited there and prayed. And the Maharani of that area came by in a carriage and heard this baby crying. And she went into the house and saw this baby apparently abandoned, and she took the baby into her home. And then this man we understood, and he said, "Now I am free." But you should not feel yourself to be free. That was a particular case. And the story my guru told me he said it was a true story. But generally speaking, you have a karmic duty to your children. And I will tell you a very interesting story from my own life. Because I went to the Bhrigu Samhita when I was in Patiala in Punjab. And the Maharaja, one of the Maharajas there, Rajas I should say, of Patiala, the father was a strange character. He had 365 wives, one for every day of the year. And anyway, one of these sons of his came to me one day. He'd been studying with me, and he said that, "Have you ever heard of Bhrigu?" And I said, "Well, no." He said, "Well, in the Bhagavad Gita, he's listed as among saints, I am Bhrigu." And I said, "Yes, of course, I remember that passage." So he said that Bhrigu wrote a Samhita, and in that Samhita, he told the past and the future of many people. And I said, "Well, when did Bhrigu live?" And he said, "Well, thousands of years ago." But he predicted these futures. So he said, "Would you like to go to him? There's a place in the town of Barnala, 60 kilometers or miles, whatever, from here. And you can go and see if there's a reading for you." Well, I was intrigued, not so much for myself, as I've always been looking for proofs of the greatness of India's ancient civilization, because I know it was very great at one time, and it is coming up again into that greatness. But I went to this Pandit, and it was a very ordinary looking town and a very ordinary looking house, and I came into the room, and there were several people seated there. And then the Brahmin Pandit came out, and the Raja of Raja Mrigendra Singh, his name was, he said to this man, apparently they were friends. He'd been there before. And he said, I want to introduce this American Swami well, obviously from America. And he said he'd like to know if there's any reading you can find for him. So he cast a horoscope, and it was a present horoscope, not a birth horoscope, so that it showed the horoscope of that moment when I mentally asked that question. And then he went into a back room and brought out a pile of patras, of pages, and put them on the floor, and he divided into 3 groups. And he said, look for a horoscope that is like the one I have drawn up here for this moment. And he gave one to me, one to Raja Mrigendra Singh, one to himself. And I was the one who found the one that looked like it. And I said, is this it? And he said, yes, this is it. So he started to read from this. And it said that in his last life, he was born in a wealthy home in Karachi. And he was married, and he was very generous, and he gave many gifts to people and to sadhus, and built ghats he built ponds, tanks for animals and so on. And he had no children, but his wife was a good woman, but she used to nag a little, and it was a little difficulty he had with her. But one day they decided to go on a pilgrimage, and they went into the desert of Rajasthan, and there they found the place where Kapila had at one time had his ashram. And there he met his guru and gave up everything and sent his wife home and devoted the next 12 years of his life to chanting. And I have a sweet voice in this life, and it could easily come from having sung to God for 12 years, I don't know. They say that in another life I had a sweet voice too, I don't know. Anyway, the interesting thing is that for 12 years he chanted to God bhajans. Then in the 12th year his wife came to him and pleaded to be accepted back. And he was very distressed at her coming. He said he had nothing more to do with women, he wanted nothing to do with them, and he sent her back to Karachi. And then it went on in the Brigu reading, a very interesting thing, and it's for this purpose that I have mentioned this story. Brigu said, it's always a conversation between Brigu and Shukra. And he said, Shukra, I will tell you a secret. A man is justified in leaving a foolish wife. If he wants to seek God and he has a wife who is worldly, materialistic, selfish, he said, in that case, when a lower dharma conflicts with a higher dharma, it ceases to be a dharma. But in this case, his wife was a good woman, and he was wrong to dismiss her when she pleaded with him earnestly to be allowed to seek God with him. And so for that reason, he didn't find the spiritual state that he was seeking in that time. Well, I won't go on with the story, but it went on to the present life, and the happy thing is it didn't give a future life, because they usually do. Anyway, the thing is that if you are married, if it's a foolish person, whether man or woman, if you want God, if it conflicts with a higher dharma, it ceases to be a dharma. But if your marriage is to a good person, you owe it to God and to your own higher self to remain with that person. So then, can you really honestly leave that person? No, you cannot. So you cannot take the vow of sannyas in the normal sense, but you can if you understand the ancient principle of the 4 varanas, is that the word? Oh, yeah, where a person is a Shudra, etc., and a Brahmin, and beginning of life you become a brahmachari, then you become a grihastha, then a vanaprastha, then a swami, then a sannyasi. And so everybody, toward the end of life, according to the ancient system, ought to devote the rest of his life to God as a sannyasi. Now, does this mean that you leave your wife? Not necessarily. An interesting thing is even this, that Babaji, as you remember from Autobiography of a Yogi, when Sri Yukteswar met him at the Kumbh Mela, Babaji said something like, "Welcome, Swamiji." And Swami Sri Yukteswar, whose name was Kriyanath, what was it?
Priyanath Karar.
What?
Priyanath Karar.
Yeah, Priyanath Karan. He said, "I am not a Swami." Babaji said, "Those on whom I bestowed the name Swami, the title Swami, never cast it off." And so what Babaji was saying is that people can be married and be Swamis if they are sincerely dedicated to God. Well, these are things that some people accept, some people don't, but they're a part of the Shastras themselves. Therefore, they must be understood as valid. And so it is right for people to become Swamis in life. But what they need to do also is understand that even in householder stage, if they've gone beyond work, the purpose of the Vanaprastha stage is to withdraw from taking care of children, family and all that, but remain there sort of like grandparents, helping the younger ones to understand Dharma and to live according to Dharma, etc. To be rigidly dharmic, for example. And then when they've implanted those ideals firmly in the family, then to withdraw them from the family and to understand that this will not be my family forever. I am a child of God. And so they become sannyasis. Well, in this state then, it is possible even to become a sannyasi. But first, it is better for married people to become tyagis and to know that they can live truly renunciate life without sex, without attachment, without the thought that this is my family. I remember, however, one thing that I was very intrigued by. When I met the Shankaracharya of Govardhan Mutt from Puri, he said to me, "That doesn't mean you should not love your family. Why should you exclude your family if you're going to love the whole human race? You have to include love for family. The importance is that you must not be attached to them as your family. But in that way, don't exclude anybody from your love." So anyway, as tyagis, this is a preparation stage for family people, householders or whatever, that ultimately they say we want to be sure in ourselves, but as brahmacharya is a preparation for sannyas, so the state of tyaga also is a preparation for sannyas. And they are not asked to be brahmacharis because they have to have their partners with them and for the sake of the children keep them and so on. But the tyagi must go beyond that stage of having children to raise and having a responsibility for them. Because having taken on that responsibility, he cannot determine what their karma shall be. They have their own karma. So it is not right for such people to become tyagis. They have to be just pilgrims. So we have these 4 stages. The pilgrim is one who is completely dedicated, but he may have a responsibility for children. He may not yet be so completely sure in himself. He knows that he wants God, but he wants to be very sure that this is what he has given his life to. After all, it does happen on the spiritual path that people take up the life and then say, well, I'm not so sure. You know that it happens, it does happen. So then, when you've reached that stage where your children have reached, let us say, at least the age of 18, and they can begin to be responsible for themselves, then after that you can become tyagis. And a brahmachari is one who has no partner and must renounce sex, must renounce romance and all those things, must renounce personal possessions, must renounce the thought of I and mine. And it is a preparatory stage also for being Nayaswamis. And the Nayaswami is one who embraces this high ideal that has been given to me by my guru. And you know, when he was alive, he put me in charge of the monks. He had gotten Mount Washington in 1925. The monks were never organized until I came in 1948. He had other things to do. It was just not his role to do that aspect of his work yet. And when I came, he put me in charge of them, and I didn't treat that responsibility as a light thing. I realized it was really very painful to me